So for us, data is not just numbers. It could be stories like teachers' observations, and the dialogues, the conversations happens between the adults and children and among children themselves as well. It could be their drawings and the moment, sometimes even children, they're not saying a word. Like the moments of silence could be like data to us.
I mean, if anything doesn't count, it's the obvious one is something like counting, actually, whereby you can say, oh, he can count, but actually does he know the fiveness of five, or is he just very good at reciting? And even then, it means he's quite good at reciting.
You're listening to Data Talks, the podcast from Data in Schools, in association with Atlanta International School and the Mona Lisa Effect, and sponsored by Veracross and IntelliSchool.
I'm Paul Swanson, Director of Innovation and Institutional Research at Atlanta International School and part of the Data in Schools team.
And I'm Matthew Savage, Educator, Leader, Consultant and Coach.
Today we're speaking with Fiona Carter and Mae Zhu and focusing on data in the early years. Mae is an experienced early childhood educator and leader with a passion for child development psychology. She's progressed from classroom teaching to leadership roles in China and is the incoming Deputy Head of School at Heber Academy Bay Area in San Francisco.
Fiona Carter is International Director at Wellington College International, where she leads new school development across the Middle East and Southeast Asia. Having previously led international school design and consultancy at Early Excellence, she also oversees early childhood and primary education quality across the Wellington Group of Schools. So welcome to our podcast, the place where data talks and we listen. Fiona and Mae, so happy to have you here on the Data Talks podcast. It's great to have you, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
I mean, I'm particularly excited about this one because even though I'm a secondary or high school teacher by training, my heart feels very much like it's in the early years, in early childhood. So I feel it's really precious and exciting to explore what data means in that realm. And I wonder in that context then, both of you, how would you define data in the early years? What counts as data? What doesn't count as data? What is data?
Like I worked in Heber Academy, Nantong currently, but my first school in Shanghai and Hangzhou. So the nursery I worked before and now, we're using Radio Amelia inspired approach and a project-based approach. So for us, data is not just numbers. It could be stories like teachers' observations, and the dialogues, the conversations happens between the adults and children and among children themselves as well. It could be their drawings and the moment, sometimes even children, they're not saying a word. Like the moments of silence could be like data to us. So for us, I think it's more about the journey, how we can record the journey of children's learning in early years. So it's not solely data for us. We are not only rely on, how many letters our children are able to pronounce, to say, and like how many numbers they can count. So in our early years, I believe in other early year settings, they may have similar practice or understanding of data as well.
Well, what I'm struck by in what I've learned about early years practice around the world is how much similarity there is actually between the very best pedagogy and practice in the early years. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds to me like you're talking about almost attunement, like tuning in to a kid's frequency, to a kid's story, wherever they happen to be at a particular time. Is that how you see it, Fiona?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about that question, what doesn't count? There's hardly anything that doesn't count, I think, in early years, because you have to be so attuned to everything a child does or appears to not be doing, because they're such complex little individuals to try and work out, particularly because they may be nonverbal. They may be really unsettled at that time. So I think you've got to be someone who could attune into all those areas. I mean, if anything doesn't count, it's the obvious one is something like counting, actually, whereby you can say, oh, he can count, but actually does he know the fiveness of five, or is he just very good at reciting? And even then, it means he's quite good at reciting. I mean, I think all the research tells us now, the first 3 years are such a sensitive time for brain development in human beings. So, and I think particularly that we know that the early interactions, which enable children, as long as they are feeling kind of happy in their own skin, really sparks all those connections. So if there was anything, if I were to assess nothing else than a child's kind of level of well-being, of attachment, and how they communicate, I think those 2 or 3, even beyond physical development, I think those areas are such important building blocks for what comes later. And I think, building on what Mae said, if you are a project-based approach setting, which we are in all of our schools, we feel it's very important. It's particularly important with young Chinese children, trying to encourage them to speak English in China. So you've got to have every trick in the book to motivate those young children to speak in English. But if that's your approach, you have to assess the key elements of that approach. So things like engagement, curiosity, all of those areas. So it's obviously not just about what they are telling you. It's about what they show you they can do and they're interested in doing.
I love what you said there about what doesn't count is counting. And you talked about how being able to count could actually be evidencing the exact opposite of being able to count.
Yes.
It reminds me of when my autistic daughter was very echolalic. There was a lot of echolalia in her speech. And so you could listen to her and think, wow, she's really mastered language at a very advanced level. But actually, if you knew her well, you knew that she was just an expert at copying other people's speech. How do you sift through then the most, I hate words like this, but valid and reliable and accurate? How do you sift through all that data so that you make sure that you and your teams are reading the data that is brimming with meaning and are kind of sifting that from the data that perhaps isn't being quite so authentic?
I mean, I think what we're allowed to do probably is more legitimate in early years, is we're allowed to observe children over different periods of time. And it's not about what's written in a book or what's written on a worksheet. So we can observe those. So I think that's a really good example, Matthew, a child who someone thinks is really articulate. And yet there are certain other areas of their either development or behaviours, or literacy is an obvious one, where they don't know the words. People say, but he's really chatty. Yes, but is he just repeating what other people are saying, or actually does he or she have a bank of vocabulary that they're drawing from? I think of a child who, even a little child who's very good at kind of inset jigsaws. Is it that they're very good at spatial awareness, or are they really good at watching you and remembering where the round one always goes? Now, that's a great skill. I think the sifting is a good way of describing it. You've really got to focus as early as practitioners on actually what you want to assess now, because the way we teach often is very, very cross-curricular. You're not just teaching history, you're teaching something else, or you're chatting about what happened at the weekend. So, yeah, it's not, in answer, it's not easy. You've got to be very good at it.
I'm curious about the language that we're using about this, talking about data, talking about assessment. And Mae, you were talking about Reggio Emilia philosophy practice. And when I think of Reggio, I think of words like documentation and the image of the child and the 100 languages of the child. And I'm curious, like when you're in that early years context, do you have to translate? How do you mediate between these different ideas? Do you put assessment in one side and then documentation in another bucket, or do you use documentation to fulfill requests for assessment? How do you think about some of these different ways of talking about data in an early years?
I think for us in the practice, we actually try to balance like children's spontaneous questions and like the elaborative design, like the structure, the part from teacher side. Because for us, we do need to support our children to flourish in like 9 learning aspects in our curriculum. So like the PSED, like the personal, social, emotional development, and their mathematics, their language, literacy, communication. So all this, the learning aspect, we can call them goals. Like for EY2, they have their own goals. For EY3, they have their own goals. So these need to be embedded in the learning environment in our intentional teaching part as well. But we know for early years, the crucial part is about the learning journey. So it's not just the teaching, like only provided or offered from the adult's voice. We need to emerge the children's voice in the project, in the journey as well. So for us, how we can balance this two part and make it harmonious is very important. So during this journey, we need to timely assess our children's engagement, try to figure out where they're interested at the moment on. Are they still kind of like want to further exploring this topic, or maybe they are a little bit interested in something else at the moment, which could be related to the current main topic. So all these timely observations will guide us adults to provide more targeted support and to set up more meaningful and purposeful provocations, we call them, in the environment. Like the setups provided in the environment, which is related to our project or children's interest, to help them to have like a deeper exploration in something. Yeah, so basically this is what are we trying to balance? It is difficult, to be honest. Like you may notice like children's interest shift very quickly. They are interested in the clock this morning, and maybe next morning they are changed to the animals. But you can always find the connections. So you're trying to extend their journey a bit longer, keep them stay in their interest as long as possible, so they can have the opportunities to have the deeper learning happen in this journey.
That brings up that question of consistency as well. I think young learners, they really challenge some of the way that we think about data. Like we want to measure something and have that be valid for more than one day or more than 1 hour. If we're saying we're evaluating their ability to self-regulate and emotional self-control types of things, I mean, any given day, that could be a wide range of across the scale, right? And so how do you approach things like that, where even an individual child might show very different levels of understanding or skill level depending on the context?
So, this is music to my ears, because I think sometimes people are quite wary of standardizing key kind of checkpoints with young children. They feel we're somehow spoiling childhood. But I don't. I think children deserve us, young children particularly, to establish those kind of key checkpoints on their flight path with their development, knowing that they will approach them at different rates. And we've been fortunate as a school network to standardize well ahead of moderating exactly what self-regulation looks like in a 2-year-old. We've just done a really big piece of work with Jan de Beel on learning behaviours. So we've selected across the whole network 10 really key learning behaviours we think are the foundations for a happy life. And we've then said, what does that look like by the end of pre-nursery? What does that look like? So self-regulation's one, metacognition, entrepreneurship. What does that look like when you're 3, when you're 2, when you're 4? And actually, yes, there's stuff written down, but it's been the massive value of those conversations amongst our fabulous teachers and practitioners, learning from each other about what to expect, but what it looks like, whether it's verbal, non-verbal, which of course is particularly important in international education because our children are so different. And then ahead of that, and then after that, rather, considering moderating those judgments as much as you can. So with the counting example, one person might say, this is how I know she or he has met that milestone, or even against self-regulation. And then the other practitioner, and we've had these conversations, haven't we? Made great, rigorous conversations between practitioners saying, no, I think they also ought to be able to show you A, B, and C. And within that, you can also kind of set your pitch, your benchmark, where you think your children could be at the end of the year with all the wonderful things that we offer to them.
Just adding on the benchmark Fiona mentioned, because I think we have an advantage to be a one nursery in a group schools. So actually we have quite a lot of moderation meetings across the school. For us, each school will have like a school representatives to to involve the discussions about what's the exemplifications of this target. So everybody will contribute their ideas. So they may give examples to us, to our understanding here. For example, in Nantong, we think if a children in high level of curiosity, which would be and others may add on to that, and they may even have more detailed conversation about like how often you are able to observe these examples on that children during the day, or in what different contexts should be all showing this type of examples from children you observed. Then it will count. Okay, this is a solid judgment. We can tick this sort of. So I think those type of moderation meetings we have as a school all together across different grades, people enjoy it, and other schools, they all contribute to really benefit us to have a understanding, have a good and solid and shared understanding for us. Okay, what is this? And why do you think it approves children's really get the skill, or they showing their competencies?
If you're a school leader, your day probably starts with questions. Who needs support? Where are the risks? What needs my attention right now? IntelliSchool helps answer those questions in real time by bringing attendance, wellbeing, behaviour and learning into one connected platform. IntelliSchool cuts through the noise and gives leadership teams the clarity they need. Fewer spreadsheets, smarter decisions, and more time to focus on what really matters, your students. Lead with confidence using IntelliSchool.
I find this so fascinating. I wonder if we can unpick that whole standardization paradigm a bit, because I know that my hackles often rise as kids get older when we expect a child of a certain age to be able to do homogenous things. And I remember when my kids were really young in the UK, as a parent, you were given what was called a little red book. And the little red book would track progress towards early developmental milestones, the meeting or not meeting of which could actually flag serious concerns that needed interventions in order for that child to live a happy life, right? So that degree of benchmarking at 18 months or 2 years, I can totally see that. And yet, if you were to benchmark me as a 51-year-old, am I doing the things a 51-year-old we should be able to do? We'd hopefully see that as ludicrous. So I wonder, standardization can allow room for expanding, but standardization can also reduce, right? So how and you talked about our obligations, and you're totally right, Fiona, our obligations to the child to not just allow things to be when they could be deeper, richer, better. But how do we get that balance right? We're talking about balance so much today already, and we'll come to it again. But how do we get that balance right? Standardization being providing space to expand rather than being something that reduces.
And I would say, I think the key thing, particularly with any age group, particularly with this age group, is the standard, the exemplification, as Mae would say. They were all narratives. So it's not the child writes this, does that. It was all, self-regulation. Something is taken away from the child. He gets a bit upset for 2 minutes, but then he goes and finds something to kind of do a trade-off. Is that right? And then, so we started with the younger children and said, but then let's raise our expectation for slightly older children and older children again. So I think standardization can raise expectations, but rather than cap them. And I also think good standardization, which massively is about, as I said, narratives, stories of children, things that you've seen already, because then that also supports maybe less experienced teachers and practitioners to say, well, sometimes people say, well, she can't do that. And you say, well, have you created a scenario for her to do that? Or is it just that kit's not on the shelf, or, they're really shy and can't pick it. So I think standardization is a really good route into planning. I think it's a really good route into resourcing, how you set up your nursery. And I think the very fact that, our schools are very much based on that project-based approaches, the exemplification comes from that context. So the exemplification needs to mirror the way that we believe we should teach our children. And then I suppose the third piece of that is that level of wellbeing involvement that we talk around a lot. So a child just doing it would not have a high level of involvement. So that's one we wouldn't have as a standard.
I wonder, to those of the audience who are not familiar with that concept, and I was hoping I knew we'd come onto it at some point, the idea of using data to measure and understand better well-being and involvement. I wonder whether one of you could just kind of give the simple potted version of the Leuven scales and how they work as a data mechanism within early years classrooms.
And so we use Leuven scales in our nurseries. Leuven scale is introduced by Dr. Ferry Livers, I think in 2018, was also invited, I think, by Fiona. So Hangzhou, when I was working in Hangzhou, this is the first time I know this team and I know this tool. So this tool is introducing two very important concepts like well-being and involvement. So well-being for early years children is linked to the self-confidence, which is a good level of self-esteem and the resilience. And involvement is about like children, how like they are showing the intensely engagement in their activities. And it's a very important condition for like deep level of learning and development. So for using Leuven scale, it's 5-point scale. Give you like 5 levels, like the level of well-being could be extremely low, could it be medium, could it be high and extremely high, and I say 5-point levels of involvement. So each level you can see detailed descriptions like what it looks like if children are extremely low at the moment. So we will use these 5-point skills to do the scanning and screening of children in different contexts for different like purpose. Then you can have a basic understanding like how well the children's well-being or involvement at the moment, or like during this kind of like a period of time, how the general well-being and involvement be like.
And presumably the standardization, the moderation of that is really important as well. Otherwise, a 5 or a 4 or a 3 from one adult could mean something totally different to another.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what was interesting when I was first really involved with the wellbeing involvement scales, it was when I worked for an organisation called Early Excellence, and we were doing the reception baseline in England, and we trained lots of people on wellbeing involvement and talked about red, amber, and green. Amber being in the middle, and as long as a child was amber against the descriptors, then you could make an accurate judgment, baseline judgment on all the other areas of learning. What the Leuven team were very, very firm about is that medium's not good enough. It needs to be better than medium. It is your responsibility as an educator for that to try and find a way for that child to be a 3+ or a 4. You know, what have you got in your toolkit? What's the atmosphere of the room? You know, have they had enough sleep? Are they anxious? All of those things. When they are a 4, what is it that's making them a 4? And it unlocks so much about what we know about children, particularly, again, if they're nonverbal, if they're young. I mean, I'm a great believer, as you know, Matthew, of doing it throughout up to 16-year-olds. I think assessing children against wellbeing involvement if you're 14 is revolutionary in terms of actually what's going on underneath. But for young children, it's really valuable. And it also, of course, like really great assessment should then support your strategy in how you teach, how you plan your room, how you plan the rhythm of the day. It's at the heart of everything.
I mean, you're talking about the importance of moderation here, but the piece that also strikes me here is this idea of data in context. Matthew, you talk a lot about the idea of warm data. It seems like a key piece of learning that educators can gather from looking at the early years specifically is about this idea of the contextuality of data. And sort of going to that piece we talked about before about documentation and, you know, showing data stories, and in what context is this child able to show these different levels of understanding. I've just tried to imagine what that conversation would look like if it were in a grade 8 English class, or if it were in a, grade 10 chemistry class, like, well, Paul is able to show a high degree of understanding of chemistry when he has, had a good night's sleep and when things were scaffolded properly. But in these other contexts, like when he's not around his friends and he's feeling very moody, he doesn't really understand chemistry as well at that point. How do you think about that idea of contextuality of data as something that is, both a strength and perhaps a point of learning from the early years for others?
For this part, I think I can give you an example, like how we try to practice the accuracy of assessment when we're using Leuven scale. And so we have a weekly good practice sharing meeting. We use this time to make sure teachers all got the chance and the space and time to discuss their perspective of what is the certain level of well-being or involvement look like. But the piece of materials we provided would be the real examples they captured in their learning time. So maybe you will record 2 minutes of children playing in a indoor exploration time. And so only that 2 minutes, and nobody is kind of interrupt that children's learning, because sometimes it's very easy for an adult in a classroom to feel like I should say something to my children, especially when someone is recording that moment, right? But we're trying to make sure children, they are really showing their learning and engaged in what they are interested at that moment. So we will record that 2 minutes and we play it to everybody. So everybody will look at it first, and they will try to use their 5-point scales to assess to their understanding what level of well-being and involvement of this 2 minutes be like. So they will, without communicating with each other, then they will mark it. Okay, I feel like it's 2. I feel like it's 3. I feel like it's 5. In the very beginning, this is possible. Some mark it as 2, some mark it as 5. Yeah. So then they will talk about why they think it's 2, why they think it's 5. During this conversation, teachers, they actually spontaneously bring us back to the previous data they observed, or the past observations they have, maybe just one day ago, or maybe in the general current 2 weeks, they have a general image of this children's play level, engaged level or well-being level. So they are triangulate different data to help them make this judgment. But actually, this is also a journey for us, because scanning and screening, Fiona know this very well. It's quite different. Scanning and screening, one is helping us know the moment. So we only try to focus on this 2 minutes. We are trying not to be distracted by the previous other things happened in the classroom or maybe at home. And the other one is you try to put everything in consideration. So I think this is what you mentioned about when we talk about can contextualize the data. One is you need to focus on the moment, but the other part, there's another part, you need to try to put other aspect of information in consideration, which will help you give a more holistic and a well-rounded understanding of the level of learning, or how is the children in our classroom in the learning journey at the moment.
And I think Paul May makes a really good point in that, no data is useful if it's not accurate. And if the context of that child, we're particularly talking about little children in August, September, is you're assessing an area of learning and they're still clinging onto their dad's leg because they're absolutely terrified of leaving in this school. That data's not going to be accurate. Just don't bother. Just don't bother recording it just yet. And May will know, when we first started working together, I was hell-bent on baseline data being in the first 3 weeks. I'm now much more relaxed about it, because with young children, if it's just not accurate, there's no point to it. If baseline data still in some cases is the idea that then when you report to the board in December, oh, look, they've made loads of progress. Well, if this is the first institution or classroom they've ever been in, that some of those numbers are going to be low in the first few weeks with someone who doesn't speak their language and a face they don't recognise. So I think data's got to be really, really as accurate as it possibly can. And the beauty of using something like the Leuven scales is that you can triangulate that. A good example is writing. A child who's not particularly motivated to write, so you're giving them an expected, but they're a child that when they have choice around what they do, they are making connections, they're solving problems, they're writing a note for their friend, putting a note on the construction model because they don't want anybody to touch it. All of those things, you can see that child can write. It's just that whatever you're offering him or her is boring. It's not interesting enough. So the great beauty of using something like Leuven is that, yes, we do record it at times, but, our practitioners will do it on a minute-by-minute basis of making a judgment. If this child's not engaged, then that means they're not showing me their full potential. And what's also interesting when using the scales is that the rationale is that actually your well-being is never going to be really fulfilled if you're not engaged. So it's striking that balance. And so the context is really important. And I think particularly with young children, young children in the early afternoon, particularly if they are perhaps an August birthday, are going to be sleepy compared to the one who's born in September. It's likely that they will crash a bit earlier because developmentally, in terms of their physiology, that's not as developed. They've been on the planet 12 months less, almost, than the child who's born in September. But that's the importance of standardization. It doesn't mean that you don't reduce the standards. You just understand the context of that assessment, which is saying, as Matthew was saying, just because he hasn't reached that milestone, fine. But actually, look, they're 11 months younger than the one who has reached that milestone. So let's not panic about it, but let's give a narrative around it.
Imagine a system that understands how independent schools work, where the soccer coach is also the algebra teacher, where parents are alumni, where everyone plays multiple roles. Most school software forces you to juggle separate systems for students, parents, alumni, donors, fragmenting the people you serve into disconnected data points. It's exhausting, and it misses what matters most. Veracross is different. One person, one record. Comprehensive software that connects every department with real-time data, all centered on the whole person. No silos, just seamless collaboration across your entire school. Veracross.com. Trusted by 3,200 schools worldwide. Imagine what you could achieve with data that works for good.
It's interesting. When I met and worked with Professor Lavers myself, what I was most surprised by, and it challenged my own thinking, was I've been banging on about well-being first, right? And he said, well, sure, but unless the kid is involved, unless the kid is given experiences through which they can immerse themselves in that flow, then the deep well-being in their learning is not going to happen. And I loved that reframing of it. And when you were speaking a moment ago, Mae, and correct me if I've misinterpreted this, but as you were describing the difference between scanning and screening in a Leuven context, it's almost like we're talking about, for any child's learning, we need to look at that learning both contextualized and decontextualized. What does that learning look like decontextualized? That's important. But also, what does that learning look like contextualized? And it's that holistic understanding of the two that perhaps we don't see enough of in those two classrooms that Paul alluded to in grade 8 and in grade 10, where they're looking at decontextualized data oftentimes and not the contextualized. Whereas what you're describing is a duality almost of the two. We actually need both of those things, which I find both challenging but also really exciting. Is that a fair interpretation?
Yeah, I think so. This is a really good interpretation. Yeah. I think for us early years educators, it's a bit easier, like using contextualized data, because they are naturally include a different aspect of data. They observe children so often during the day, and they will also have so close conversation with the parents. So we have very tight, like a homeschool communication. So we are collecting the information from parent side as well, like what happened at school, what happened at home. So we are put everything together. So it's quite natural for teachers think as like a whole of the children. They are bringing different pieces together, and now it becomes the whole image of our children. But the other part, actually, compared to grade 10 or grade 8, like educators, they are familiar with, decontextualized may be a bit difficult, challenging for us sometimes. We need to try to remind ourselves, let's focus on this 2 minutes first, because we are trying to figure out the current setup provocations in the environment are really helping engaging our children in the exploration. If you put other informations in, maybe the understanding of the effectiveness of this provocation at the moment will be not that accurate. So these two are the things to balance, but it's not easy.
Have you experienced, or could you maybe share any examples where bringing those two different ideas together challenged some of your assumptions about a child? And I can imagine a teacher who thinks they know a kid is like, oh, this kid's a great kid, it always does well, because they're thinking in that contextual piece. But then when they really just look at that 2 minutes, like, actually, during that 2-minute section, little Paul was not at his best there. Do you see that conversation between the contextualized and the decontextualized as helping clarify or challenge assumptions and biases and things like that about kids?
Yes. In our practice of moderation, try to get the most accuracy judgment across the team of what is the good level of well-being or involvement. We have some teachers in the beginning, for example, we are trying to focus on this 2 minutes of the observation and assessment. And some teacher may give it 3. Well-being, let's say, and some teacher will give it a 5 or 4. And when we ask why, they were saying, because I noticed today she's showing really happiness. I noticed this morning when she walked in, so you can see actually she's trying to put different information in this conversation, not just about this 2 moments of playing of this child. Yeah, so she's giving this child a higher level of well-being of this 2 minutes. But this will actually distract us for the deeper conversation about how we can improve this 2 minutes experience or the journey. Because it's not accurate of this 2. It's about the children is showing higher level of well-being in the early morning. But it's different now.
There's a confirmation bias. You're expecting them to show a higher level because you've seen that higher level in the past. So you sort of see what you expect to be seeing rather than what's actually there.
Yeah. And sometimes teachers, especially we're talking about their children, so they always want to show positive part of their children. Sure. Actually, these children should be higher because maybe something happened. So they are making some reasons or find some reasons for their children being not so high level of well-being and involvement at these 2 moments. But gradually, because we are send the vision to them, this is not about if we want them always be high or always showing really good level, extreme high level of well-being and involvement. It's all about because we care of our children's level of well-being and involvement. So we want this conversation can help us. What else can we do to provide them a better and more effective and spontaneous or responsive learning environment to them? So gradually teachers will put that kind of a concern down so they can focus on okay, this is not about if I'm doing this right or wrong. It's about children.
I wonder between you, I'm thinking about listeners whose experiences with older kids. And I'm thinking how powerful it would be if either one or other or both of you could share something about a child you remember, a child with whom you're working this year or with whom you worked last year or the year before, where this holism you're talking about, this duality of decontextualized and contextualized, enabled you to get a deeper, better, to use your word, Fiona, more accurate understanding of that child's story in such a way that actually changed the direction in which they could go. Are you able to share a specific scenario or a specific child where that trajectory has changed as a result of this approach?
as an educator, you've heard something from the parent who drops off, or I can think of a little girl in a school for pupils with very complex needs, and all the children were non-verbal, and it was trying to find a way of increasing this child's level of involvement. And the grandma who dropped off happened to mention that on the way to school, the little girl always saw some hens and chickens in someone's garden, and that was her big moment. And so this amazing teacher got loads and loads of little kind of models of chickens, pictures of hens, and put them either in the play garage, in the water, in the sound. And this child being alive, absolutely alive, because you kind of tapped in not only what motivated her, but there's all this kind of subliminal way of thinking they know me. And I think that connection with their real world, which is sometimes hard, even if you're in a state school here in England, because often we're working with children from different backgrounds to our own, or certainly international schools. And I also think of a little girl from the Cameroon, and she was playing with the dolls in the role play corner, and someone happened to have left a scarf. And it was a child who wasn't very verbal, really didn't want to be left by mum in the mornings. When she realised, she got this scarf and put the baby around her back and wrapped her up. Then the next day she just, came into school, found the scarf and wrapped the baby around the back, and then carried on, because it linked to what she knew. And it's as if we knew her. So I think it's about knowing children. And anyway, whether it's the learning scales, whether it's just chats with parents or grandparents or whoever, I think the more you know children of any age, but particularly young children who don't always have the words to explain to you what's important to them, if you can connect that with in a very material way, I think that then taps into, I always say to people, if children are struggling to learn their sounds, you can do as many interventions as you want in the corridor, but if they are not if they are not happy to be there and they don't feel safe and they haven't attached to an adult in that room, there's no point. That's the main thing you have to work on.
And Professor Gare Grouse, who was behind the Kidsania centres around the world, where kids get to try on an adult vocation or role or identity, he often refers back to, I think it was Tim Brighouse, who used to talk about the importance of knowing what flavour of crisps your children like, which is not dissimilar to knowing that kid's life came alive when they saw their morning chickens.
Yes.
And the holism we're alluding to here is about getting to know those little but huge things in a child's life that help us to see things through their eyes, I suppose.
Yeah.
And not just knowing those things about them, but making sure that they know that we know those
Completely.
things about them, so that they feel seen as well.
Yes, exactly that.
I wonder if there's something it's something I wanted to get onto during this conversation, because it really matters to me. And we're talking a lot here about how this is how data can work, should work, could work within an early years setting. We've made different references to how data might look in a grade 10 or a grade 8 class. You've taught, Fiona, about how the Leuven scales could work up to 16, but why stop at 16? Why couldn't they work up to 18, university, within a group of professional colleagues, etc.? And with all of that in mind, if we look at the very best early years classroom, we'll see this holism coming to fruition as a result of recognizing the duality of those two different types of data and knowing the hen or the crisps or whatever else. And this isn't kind of high school or middle school bashing in any way, because extraordinary things are done daily within those classrooms and corridors. But how do we balance the two, right? Because we could find ourselves saying within an IB classroom, an A-level classroom, this is the way in which data can be used most powerfully. And then we can talk in the same way about how it can be used most powerfully with 3-year-olds. But where could things be common? Where could things be similar? Where could actually data be operating and instrumentalized in very similar ways, whether the child is 3 or 13, 8 or 18? Because I wonder sometimes whether there are far fewer things that need to be as different as they are, and whether data might be a place where we could start when looking for that I suppose, vertical articulation or contiguous journey or consistency.
It's a through line.
Yeah.
Is there a question there, Matthew?
I need to simplify it then maybe. The question is, could the rest of a school learn from early years data practice such that they can use very similar strategies with data themselves?
Yes. Yes, I would say. And I think I was going to say, if you flip that, because, numbers, and May is exactly right. Data is what you know about the child. It's not just numbers. But numbers make people and boards and head teachers sit up and listen. And so I think anything, as long as whatever you are making into any numerical form counts, like wellbeing and involvement, like engagement, like self-regulation, like metacognition, like entrepreneur, all of those things, then the more you can align them with numbers, the more people will listen. And early years particularly need people to listen. Early years is a very, very expensive part of a school. You will know this, Matthew, as an ex-head teacher. It needs the most people. It needs the most stuff. The fees are often lower. So, we have to fight often for what we want to provide. So I don't think early years should be afraid of representing data in numerical form. I think that's important. I don't think we're doing children a disservice. I think what you say is also really important, because triangulating with how children feel about themselves as learners, triangulating with how good they are at problem solving, perhaps, or mathematical application when it's a self-choice or a game or playing outdoors, but they may not show that or reflect that when they're writing in a worksheet. And equally, does a worksheet cap the learning? Actually, are they able to do more than you've asked them to do? So, yeah, in answer, I absolutely think that, and I know when we've presented, and I look at, wonderful teachers like May, when they presented their data to a board, you can see the board saying, wow, why aren't we getting this same kind of imagery and whole picture of our children for older students? Why are we only getting for younger students?
So what could our middle school English teacher or our high school chemistry teacher learn from educators like you and your colleagues about how data could work?
For the biggest part, I think our secondary teachers may learn from early years educators about how we view data. So for us, Fiona mentioned that again, it's not just numbers. It's also telling you the story of children, how they learn. So for us, we have data like a characteristic of effective learning. This is not their knowledge data. This is about how we know their learning behaviors they showing in their journey of learning. So we are collecting this type of data to help us have a more holistic understanding of the children. Are they showing the risk-taking skills? Are they trying to solve the problem by themselves? Are they trying to use different communication skills? So all these are not knowledgeable. These are not knowledge level. This is their skills, how they, when they encounter the difficulties or challenges in their learning, how they can show their own abilities to solve this type of problems. But currently in the secondary schools or even in primary sometimes, they are lack of this type of data. Like in us, we are using PASS, P-A-S-S, PASS data, but this is kind of solely rely on children answering the questions. So they are taking a survey. The survey asks certain questions and they answer the questions by themselves. But this is just one way you can collect how children feel certain things about themselves and record it. Right? But for example, grade 1 and 2, they actually are not such capable like elder children to do a survey. So maybe the accuracy would be a thing we need to consider. And also, how can we collect other information to help us know better of this child? It's not only rely on themselves, say, answering the questions. So I think this is the part secondary and the primary teachers, they can learn from early years educators about how to collect more information from more aspects of their children so they can have a clearer and more well-rounded image of the child in their classroom.
I wonder, though, I mean, lots of primary and secondary, middle school, high school teachers do collect data on characteristics of effective learning, on attitudes to learning, on those learning behaviors. But I wonder whether the difference, perhaps from what you guys are saying, is that in early years, that data is part and parcel of the main data set. Whereas the older kids get, sure, we have that data, but it's, if not peripheral to, certainly distinct from the academic data. So I wonder if that is a distinction that you could speak to, and also to, and I'm the master of the complex question that Paul's already pointed out. But when I think of, I talk about triangles, we talk about triangulation, context, etc. The province of Ontario in Canada in 2010, as part of their growing success model, they devised a triangle which consisted of knowing a child through observation, conversation, and product. And to really simplify things, I wonder, how can we get more conversation and observation into the high school classroom? And they could argue, could there be more product in the early years classroom? So that's, I suppose, what I mean when I'm looking at the contiguous journey, data working in a similar way. Is there anything in that resonates at all? Yeah,
I mean, I think that, you know, if I'm helping moderate in the early years, the one skill which an area of learning we absolutely have to have a product is writing. You just do. You can't not. It's something that you have to, and you know. And I know some early practitioners, that's kind of a bit wincy, but because it feels as if, but it's important that we get an accurate judgment of where children are. And I'm a great believer, Matthew, in that if something isn't assessed, it's not taught implicitly. It can get missed. And so, you know, there we are, you know, a lot of our schools do the IBDP, where massively all those skills are assessed, are brought into the qualification. And yet it's not assessed at IGCSE. So, but yet in the early years, we spend loads of time and effort and money and all of those things to make sure children have characteristics of effective learning. But then if we're not careful, if we don't assess and report those characteristics of learning throughout the rest of school, kind of, like I say, it's not forgotten, but it's not always taught explicitly, which I think wellbeing has come a very long way in terms of that being important to parents and being important on reports and important to board members. But in terms of those skills, the learning behaviours, as Mae referred to, I think it's important that they are assessed and represented. And that's actually why we've started doing that piece of work, because we've kind of come to the conclusion learning behaviours can be taught. It's not just by chance. Assessment should never be seen in isolation, and assessment's not recording. It's, you know, as teachers we make, I don't know, I think, you know, I've had 1,000 assessments or judgments, you know, every hour, probably on who should sit where and who should do this. We're making it all the time, but you don't write it down. So, you know, I think, and I also take your point. I think, you know, when Mae first started the conversation about documentation, that's a great way of assessing what children know, because if they choose what they want to document, that's what's important to them. But it also shows the level of their understanding of the concept, rather than it just repeating what somebody said.
I think, Fiona, about that in the piece, you know, if it's not an explicit expectation, it runs the risk of getting missed. For most, I think, high school teachers, middle school teachers, it's not an explicit expectation that they know about the interests and the desires and the proclivities of their kids, knows that they love chickens, right? We're going to have to close the conversation. I feel like we could talk for hours, but I'll leave you with a wonder. I wonder how different the rest of the school and rest of the teachers might be if, as part of their report comment, they were expected to share something that they know about the child that wouldn't normally sit on a report card and isn't necessarily academic. Thank you again for an amazing conversation. I really appreciate your time.
Our pleasure. Thanks so much. Thanks, Mae.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you, both of you.
Really enjoyed the conversation.
Tune in next time as we continue our data conversations with educators and thought leaders from around the world.